Good evening, everyone. Hi, we're just getting everybody finally seated. Have you had a good day? It's been pretty neat, hasn't it? Well, it's not over. So I get to introduce something quite special, and in conversation with Richard Curtis. Richard's going to be interviewed by Matthew Freud. Freud runs a public relation organisation that Public Health England has worked with for years, and we have a very good and strong relationship with. And Matthew will be interviewing Richard. Now, everybody must know Richard. Anybody follow Blackadder? Richard's the writer of Blackadder. I mean, 4 weddings and a funeral. I had to make sure it wasn't 3 weddings and 4 weddings and a funeral. And Love Actually. Everybody must have seen that. Perhaps less famous for, but not to many of us, I'm sure, is Richard's a founding Comic Relief, Red Nose Day, the most amazing social movements anywhere in the world. So we have an evening with Richard, and I'd like to introduce Matthew and Richard right now.
In case there's any confusion, I'm Matthew.
Yes, and I'm Richard, that's right.
I first met Richard when he started sleeping with my sister.
Oh, shame. Shame. Which, wait a minute, it happened 2 years after I'd met her. I think that was a very decent length of time.
Second date, I think. It was a long time ago, sort of 25, 30 years ago, and I was a big fan of Not the 9 O'Clock News, which Richard wrote, and of Blackadder, and I was very sort of chuffed when he asked me to read this script that he was thinking of turning into a film. And I read it and told him that it had no chance of being made and wasn't funny. And after 4 Weddings and a Funeral, he then gave me the script of Notting Hill, which I said was like a classic pop band's second album and should just be discarded and he should move on. So he hasn't consulted me on any of his creative work since then, but we have collaborated on his campaigning work, and I've sort of watched over the last 25 years in awe as he's gone from making the world laugh to making the world cry and then laugh, and then sort of change their attitudes to some of the really critical issues that we'll talk about today. Just as an intro, Richard was recently given the Cannes Lions Award, which is called the Lionheart Award. He followed Bono and Al Gore for people who'd used marketing to change the world. And we're just going to watch a little film which will just bring you up to speed on what Richard's other life is.
Red Nose Day, make some noise! We're going to give you a night of TV you'll never forget.
Beautiful. I know.
And the last remaining people.
What about me? I'm a buffer.
This is the most successful Red Nose Day ever! This love is a blaze, I saw flames from the side of the stage, and the fire brigade comes in a couple of days. Until then, we got nothing to say.
That sounds like a little girl.
Do you think, quack quack? I am a university professor.
Why are you wearing glasses? To be honest, I thought that'd be a little bit, incognito.
My name's Ben Stiller, and this is the Red Nose News National News Network.
I'm the best at charity!
I want Orlando Bloom to seduce a watermelon.
I want to spend the rest of my life with you.
Wow, I think I love you.
Really, truth is, you can fundraise any way you want.
Welcome.
Welcome!
Welcome to Red Nose Day.
Tonight's about the kids.
I just think as a parent, I don't know how you learn to manage, but Also, the amount of loss that must go on back here is probably inconceivable to most of us.
When we come here to see it, when it gets too much, you can just leave the room. And they can't just walk away from it because it's every single day.
Being diagnosed as HIV positive can be devastating.
It all comes back to the stigma, and it kind of creates like a living hell for us.
This is Bob. Loneliness was his enemy.
One evening she turned round and she looked at me and she said, "Where's Bob?" And I'm Bob. And the bottom dropped out of my world then.
They're not just numbers, they're not just statistics, they're real people, and you are helping to change their lives.
My pleasure to announce the total raised by Comic Relief and Sport Relief since we first started is over £1 billion. In fact, it's £1,047,083,706 sterling.
While we are eating, 100 million children are nearly starving. Children who are then so weak they'll die if a mosquito bites them. And so they do die. 1 every 3 seconds. There they go. And another one.
Somebody's daughter. Somebody's son. And the thing is, all these deaths are avoidable.
Are you ready to start a revolution?
We have a plan. The global goals for people and planet.
60,000 people on the Great Lawn at Central Park watching these incredible bands that's being live streamed to a dozen different places, and all of it is for the purpose of ending global poverty. This is like my fantasy.
These are the United Nations global goals
for sustainable development.
Let's get to work. Let's make it happen.
That's got to give a round of applause, isn't it? It's a kind of remarkable body of work over a 25 year period that I think has touched, I mean, there can't be anyone in this room who hasn't had a direct relationship with some of those campaigns. When you obviously started Red Nose Day in response to the crisis in sub-Saharan Africa in '85.
Yes.
When did the focus move to the UK and UK issues as well as the crisis there?
Well, actually, it was always there because the charity that we chose to work with was in fact already working on homelessness here. So in fact, when there was a moment of confusion when Comic Relief was also called Charity Projects, and Charity Projects had been an organisation here that was working on homelessness and had organised a couple of events for that. And I seem to remember the first time we did Red Nose Day, it was 80-20, 20% just going to the UK because we thought that we should cover it, and then it moved to 60-40, and Sport Relief is now 50-50. So it's always been, I mean, I think we wouldn't feel comfortable doing Red Nose Day unless, you know, huge amounts of money came here to the UK as well.
And so there's $1 billion plus raised and spent, and you went from an organisation that was just raising money and giving it to umbrella charities to building one of the sort of preeminent grant-giving organisations. How did you sort of navigate a world you were comfortable with in terms of entertainment and communications to one that and everyone in this room knows how hard delivery is to coordinate and oversee.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a very long, been a very long process in the hands of, I'm deeply aware here talking to you that all the issues that we're talking about, particularly to do with what makes people safe and what makes people healthy, every single one of you will know more about than I actually do. And so the only promise that I can make is that we've done it by consulting incredibly responsibly. So what we did the first time we did Red Nose Day, in fact, we just gave 50% of the money to Save the Children, 50% of the money to Oxfam abroad. And then we started taking on board large groups of not consultants, but experts who joined our UK Grants Board and our international grants board, and then the size of our grants department grew because it's so important to get report backs and to actually check people before you give money, and people are very, very keen to know what's going to be effective rather than what's just going to be dramatic or easy. So there's been a whole 25-year story of effective spending of the money.
And it goes across a huge variety of different projects, isn't it? I mean, one of the things that interests me is how Comic Relief has consistently tackled quite difficult issues that I think you felt weren't getting enough public attention. How have you sort of picked those battles?
Well, it's been an interesting story. I mean, it's I don't know what it's so interesting because when you talk about Comic Relief, people still strangely think about sort of Lenny Henry in Africa. The sort of images are so unusual and often so unbelievably dramatically sad, where you can actually see a child die on film, that it means that issues here in the UK do not hang in people's memories, even though we often on The Night and on documentaries that we've done have given an equal amount of time to them. And in fact, what we decided to do in the UK was, because we were dealing with something that was so obviously emotional, at least publicly, in Africa and then internationally, because we now spend money in lots of countries around the world, is we actually decided to use Comic Relief, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but slightly as a wolf in sheep's clothing, except I mean a nice wolf. As it were, because issues like elder abuse, domestic violence, teenage suicide, dementia,
child carers,
young carers, these issues are hard for charities to raise money for, much more money for donkeys. And so we always thought that it was fair enough that since people trusted us because we felt we were trustworthy and because we told the truth on the day, that we would actually not deal with, for instance, we've never dealt with, although I don't say there's a line, but we don't deal with cancer, we don't deal with heart disease, we don't deal with sick children in quite the same way, although we dealt a lot with mental illness. So that's what we've particularly tried to do, is one, illuminate and work in these areas, but secondly, use our kind of mass popularity as a way of addressing more complicated, hard to raise money for issues.
I always thought that the great gift in the UK for Red Nose Day was the incredibly powerful relationship with the BBC, which was sort of anchored partly in your historic relationship with them, but also your ability to unlock the sort of celebrity and entertainment industry support. When you took Red Nose Day to the US, where you're with NBC, which is in some ways a sort of tenth of the impact of the BBC, how did you unlock the sort of star power there?
Well, it's been a bit harder. I don't know. Not as many people in America owe me money, as it were, as they do here. And I mean, I'm sure, my relationship with the BBC is very complicated. The BBC are complicated to deal with because They have to be so impartial. All the things that make the BBC excellent also make it hard, in a way to raise quite as much money as you'd want. I remember we once pre-recorded one of our appeal shows, and we couldn't say, take your phone out of your pocket. We sort of had to say, if you were to have a phone in your pocket, then perhaps you might take it out, because it wasn't happening in the present time and we couldn't use the dramatic present. But I'm wondering whether the relationship between the BBC and NBC is similar to the relationship that you might have between the National Health Service and what you would get if you went to America, which is something trickier, much more complicated, much more based on money and whether or not it's going to deliver audiences and money, everything like that. So, it's been harder getting the support, even though we've got unbelievable support from NBC. It's not qualified to suddenly give you 4 radio stations and lots of local networks and all the other TV stations and things like that.
I think we've got a little film of one...
Oh, of some friends.
Some friends from...
in America.
Yeah, let's have a look at this, because it's funny.
Red Nose Day.
It's an important cause, which is why
We're doing that thing where
A bunch of celebrities
Are edited together.
so that each celebrity says one sentence
Or less.
of a heartfelt plea.
Or says nothing.
And just looks serious. Were any of us ever in the same room together?
No, we were not.
But is it pretty impressive there are so many of us?
Yeah, it is.
Very.
And that we're facing in the right direction. Oh, sorry. Right direction.
That's impressive too.
But there are downsides.
Group pleas like this can leave celebrities who are used to being the center of attention feeling
Underutilized, superfluous, and insignificant.
Also, sometimes
A person will try to get to the bottom of a serious social issue and try to keep abreast of the solutions to it and bare our souls.
As we ask for help.
But in the end, realizes embarrassingly that all they've said is
Bottom?
and
Abreast.
and
Our souls.
it can be hard to understand why some of us get a ton of screen time and others barely get
Any.
or why the camera lingers incomprehensibly on.
Some of us.
There has to be an explanation of why a major star sometimes just gets a one-syllable word to say.
While some guy who was in a sitcom years ago and died in Jurassic Park, of course, gets to go on and on and
On.
The answer is
It's not about ego.
It's not about us.
It's about
Red Nose Day.
Please.
give.
What?
you can.
thank you.
Seriously? That's all I got? On?
You were lucky. Bono just got a serious look.
I mean, the horrible truth about that is it was quite embarrassing getting some people in to say one word. And the less they had, the nicer. I think we actually made lunch for Julianne Moore and picked her children up from school because in the end she was only going to do the one word. But there we go. It's very interesting. In America, we just give the money to children. It's helping kids. And it's interesting. That's all part of the kind of shift to a slightly more obvious and slightly more commercial thing. Whereas in the UK, we've been able to be, complicated.
Yeah. Moving on a bit, I remember you showing me a PowerPoint deck for Make Poverty History in about 2004. And I thought you were bonkers in sort of taking on this extraordinary role coming up to the G8 in the UK. How did that come about?
There have been a couple of strange, moments or changes in my life when I decided to go from fundraising to campaigning. And I remember talking to Bob Geldof, and he said to me that he'd made more money in 45 minutes with having a cup of tea with President Mitterrand than he did by the whole of Live Aid and Band Aid and everything like that, because they just changed their, foreign aid from 0.005 to 0.0051, So I decided that time would be well spent trying to publicly campaign. And so there was a good connection between a very supportive Labour government on these issues, the fact that we were head of the G8 that year, and then the fact that it was a third of the way through the Millennium Development Goals. So he thought, if anyone's going to make a lot of noise any time, this is the opportunity. And then the big thing was then trying to get Bob Geldof to do Live 8, as it were. So...
and he kept you waiting.
He kept us waiting till he thought of the joke, Live 8 and things. One of the funniest moments of my life was the afternoon when Bob was trying to get the group, the super group together. And he always keeps his phone open. And so during the course of an hour, I heard him talking to Pete Townsend, Mick Jagger, and Paul McCartney. And three people more like three characters in Winnie the Pooh. You cannot imagine. Pete Townsend is Eeyore. Mick is Tigger, as it were, and Paul is, what's the little one?
Piglet.
Piglet, yeah, exactly, I think. But there we go.
And my other memory of that period was the Make Poverty History Alliance, which I think was 125 different NGOs and organisations who you had to try and keep vaguely happy, which might ring bells with those of us in the room who've had to do those difficult multi-stakeholder activist things. I mean, how tough was that?
That was extremely difficult. I mean, I don't know how it does relate to people's experiences, but people come into things with. I once asked the Make Poverty History sort of ruling body how many of them wanted us to succeed, and it was under half, because most of them had been, as it were, raised on anger, and they thought in a way it would be better for the movement to fail and be seen to fail than to succeed. So that was a complicated dynamic.
I think for lots of people, the first thing we knew about the Millennium Development Goals was around Make Poverty History, and you then got sort of sucked into the Sustainable Development Goals in a kind of meaningful way. How did that?
Well, what I thought would happen after. Can I just generally say here about how brilliant I think that Public Health England is? Just I'm worried about talking about myself when you're all here and you all do such remarkable kind of work. And I do think it slightly relates to the things we're talking about the sort of creation of this body that tries to influence. I mean, you know what you do more than I do, but I've learned a little bit about it, but trying to influence great areas of behavior and to actually try and find out facts and information which will, in a big way, change the health in the UK in the same way that I've hoped that the MDGs and the SDGs will do that. That idea of being able to slightly stand back and watch where the key areas are and put resources into those areas rather than just endlessly being overrun by the problems of the day. And so, I mean, the SDGs, I've just increasingly become aware of the dispiriting nature of pessimism in the face of the world's problems, and the way that the news focuses on things that are not good rather than things that are extraordinary. And the way I think that people actually need a plan, need proof of progress, need hope, need deadlines. And it seemed to me that, as it were, as my last job, I should try and do all I could to make the Sustainable Development Goals more popular, more famous, well-known, simpler, all that kind of stuff, in order to give people a positive plan that they could, follow, and that's what I've been trying to do.
And she says,
I've lost a lot of battles, by the way. I've said SDG sounds like a sexual disease, which it does, and I call them the global goals whenever I can, but I was ticked off by a lot of people for that, and I tried to see if we could try and make them 15, but there were 12, but there are 17 of them, and maybe that's fine because life is complicated. But we've on other areas, how they're represented graphically, how they're named, all of that, we've had some success.
And you set out to try and tell 7 billion people about them because you thought if everyone knew them, they had more chance of success.
I mean, on the, and I think you guys do a lot of this. You just tell people what the problems are, and they're in a much better position to address them. You can't fight for your rights if you don't know what your rights are. And one of the interesting, and also, the governments of our countries make an implicit promise to us that they will improve our lives. And yet, politicians inevitably are, or often, extremely short-term, and we're not cynical about politicians all the time, because I think many of them work for exactly the purposes we expect them to work, but they also have short-term needs in terms of getting elected and doing things. No business would think of not having a 15-year plan. So I've tried to make them as fun as they can be.
With no money. I mean, the budget for a communications campaign that targeted 7 billion people on the planet was what?
None. Yeah. No, it's an interesting thing. I don't know if this, I'm always, and I understand the reasons, but sometimes the government will pass an amazing bill or do something good or new or interesting. And the way it is leaked out into the world is some depressed undersecretary wandering into a small and ghastly room with 4 exhausted journalists, be as dull as they can for 6 minutes and then walk out. You think, but that's going to save so many lives. That's going to change so many lives. And the UN, because its job is to, do incredibly important things, not only with regard to the SDGs, but with regard to peace and all those issues, does not feel it can spend that much money on marketing. And I'm a great believer in the power of marketing to create energy to drive towards change. And that's where I think some of the public campaigns that Public Health England are behind are so unbelievably important, because it'll actually start people in their own lives doing things rather than having to just endlessly only change the law and rely on politicians to change things.
I want to talk a little bit about some of the specific campaigns that you've been involved in. I remember when you were doing Make Public History, and you sort of said to everyone, whatever you do something in that to help what we're trying to do. And when it came to malaria, and you got very involved in the malaria campaign, and you wrote a film called
Mary and Martha.
Yeah. Which I mean, it was a beautiful Richard Curtis film, but it also, you couldn't watch it and then not come out with a very, very clear understanding of what the issues around malaria were and what some of the solutions were. But what was your sort of malarial journey?
One funny thing about that, I don't know if any of you saw that film. It had Brenda Blethyn and Hilary Swank in it. It was on the BBC. And I remember going into the head of BBC One and saying, I think we'd like Julie Walters to be in the film. And she said, oh, Imelda Staunton. And I said, no, Julie Walters. And she said, I've been here 4 years, and every time I've been promised Julie Walters, I always get Imelda Staunton. So let's not lie about it. Let's face facts from the very beginning. And she didn't even get Imelda Staunton. But no, Brenda's just as good as both of them. Yeah, I mean, the thing about malaria, and I'm sure you find this, it's a very interesting thing when you find something about what you're doing that rings a bell with the public. And sometimes you only have to tell not a tenth of the truth, but you focus on one thing in order to get the support going. And when we realized at Red Nose Day that a net a malaria net cost £5, and in fact it now costs £2.50, I think, and that could be shown to save someone's life. That was an extraordinary moment in terms of fundraising. We really did raise a lot more money, and so I just took that as an example, not a metaphor, but an example of how we really could change people's lives. And I thought the more that people know about this, the better, because if they really believe it's making a difference, then they will always be generous on these issues. And so I decided eventually to write a film about it. And there was a great moment. I had a really nasty, a lovely Australian director with a harsh tone called Philip Noyce. And I remember him ringing me up and saying, "You haven't even done your fucking research." Because there's only 600,000 kids dying of malaria and you've written 1 million. What the fuck's going on? And I said, well, look, I wrote the film 3 years ago and it was 1 million. So this is fundamentally good news rather than bad news. And that figure would be 250 now, I think, or something like that. I mean, it's an absolutely extraordinary thing. So why I was trying to write the film, for two purposes. One, to save lives, because I think it's very easy in all our jobs to, no, maybe not in yours, but it is easy when you're making comedy to forget the sort of simultaneity of suffering, just to literally remember that children are dying every single day of unnecessary things and people are suffering every day of unnecessary things. And so I wrote it, to encourage generosity, but also, in fact, to tell a story of real hope and change and progress.
Yeah.
The power of optimism, I really believe in, and I think we have to be really careful to pick our optimistic stories as well. I mean, the tide's against you, and if ever you can pick out good stories and things that are getting better, do tell that story too. There was a very depressing day last year. It was a fabulous day, but depressing it's the news coverage. I was in New York and a small, badly built bomb went off in a dustbin on 6th Avenue and hurt no one. And that very day, the Global Fund got $13.6 billion in the fight against malaria, TB, and HIV. I mean, it will save 1 million lives at least a year. And the bomb, the non-bomb, was on the front of the newspapers 3 days in a row, and no mention of this astonishing human achievement of bringing countries together in order to solve these diseases. So we have to fight for the good stories as well as telling the rotten ones.
It's a neat link into Ebola, which is one of the things that I think links you and PHE.
Yeah, extraordinary work. I mean, Duncan told me a bit about the crucial job of, makes me feel very proud of us with regard to Ebola. A long way away, but brilliant that we, British wisdom and compassion and planning saved so many lives there. I mean, I remember standing nearby the head of the World Bank when he was talking. But he was saying about Ebola, and this must have been September 2015, and they were really frightened it was going to be catastrophic, and saying, I can give you billions today. He said, just nobody can tell me how to spend it. He said, I can literally write a check for billions today, but no one's got a plan. And so it's brilliant that PHE was part of the plan.
We've got another little film about that.
Oh, this isn't about that.
That's not about that. It's a technical snubber. Can we stop this film? Sorry. And go to the next one.
That's a film about the
global goals. We spared you it.
We do song for song. You sing one, then I sing one, yeah?
Ẹ ṣé Olúwa, ẹ ṣé Bàbá o, ẹ ṣé Olúwa, àwa dúpẹ́ bàbá.
We'll be loving you till we're 70. And baby, my heart is still beating.
It's been over 3 years since the outbreak of Ebola killed over 11,000 people in West Africa. There aren't any live cases of it here now, but you still come across the after effects of it everywhere. When Ebola hit, what was it like?
My father was sick. Dying of vomiting, toileting. They came to the Ebola center. The next morning, they bring the diagnosis in time.
When was the last time you went to school?
Last year, I was seeing my father. Tell my father was leaving. I told him to go to school. But saying that we need Ebola time, I can't go to school. When I grew up, I want to become a musician. I want to become singing for people in church.
I think that's gonna happen. You got a beautiful voice. The thing that's stopping her getting her dreams is, she hasn't got a dad, and it's up to her to bring money in. She's only 12. All right.
Sing this song, so I remember my dad. Hakuna wakasasa Yesu, hakuna wakasasa ye, hakuna wakasasa Yesu, habu jina.
What's up, Peaches?
So don't why tears remind you you're alive.
Last thing I always wanted this trip to be was to be the celebrity who comes over to Africa and cries on TV and sends your money over. I really wanted to come and be like everything's positive, everything's great. And then I don't know, I was just singing with that girl, and she was all really smiling, and then she just started crying, Her dad taught her how to sing, and she just got really choked up about it. I watch Comic Relief every single year, and this is always what celebrities do. And I always think, is it really that bad? And then I sort of turn up and, yes, it is. That's just one girl out here. It's just one story. And it's the one girl that came up to talk to us and was the smiliest. And there's so many kids out here that I've gone up to and sort of tried to speak to that just shut off. And if she's the smiliest one and she's got that story, God knows what the other stories are. But here's the really important thing. To get a little girl like Peaches back into school for a whole year only costs 45 quid. So please give what you can. You can really completely change lives tonight. Thank you.
Ed is such an interesting guy, and I think very interesting example of, a new generation. I'm very, what I'm finding dealing with younger people is they are much more sort of sophisticated and international and implicitly inclined to be activists. I think the upside of the downside of the complicated governments, both in the UK and in the USA, is that nobody's now thinking, I can sit back and wait, it's being taken care of. And Ed is such an interesting man, not only because he's sort of fundamentally decent, but, he, apart from, taking care of her and lots of people he met, next time I saw him, he was wearing a hat, which said Tina, which is not there is no alternative. It stands for This is New Africa. And he's actually trying to also contribute to things in Africa by including an increasing number of African musicians in his music. And he has an absolute deal that whenever he features an African artist, he will feature on one of their songs. He doesn't want to be responsible for taking from them and not putting back from them. And I think that I'm very optimistic that people like him and, like our sons and daughters and stuff are going to have a much richer, more complicated attitude to problems abroad, and also be much more aware of how they're the same as our problems here. And this is one of the things, whether we're going to get to it, about the SDGs, which I think is so important, which is that when Obama first spoke about them in 2015 at the UN, he said, my first job as American president is to apply them here in my own country. And it's brilliant that you guys and PHE are also taking on board the Sustainable Development Goals and looking at how they apply to our country, as much as, they're under huge responsibilities we have, as much as thinking that they're to do with people in Liberia.
The other bit of common ground with PHE is your work on mental health. Can you share a little bit about what your motivation is?
It's a sensitive. I mean, there's an interesting thing. I don't know whether you are all feeling this, but I feel as though Comic Relief has spent an enormous amount of money on mental health projects, and particularly on projects that are trying to change people's attitudes to mental health issues. And I suddenly feel it's starting to tip. And I think we do all work away for all our lives and think all we're achieving is the thing we're achieving that day. And then sometimes you realize that the thing that you've been working for has got far enough to actually start spreading with extra speed. And I don't know, I mean, we've been working on mental health issues, and I suddenly feel, again, particularly with this young generation, that they understand that mental illness is not the same as physical illness, but is as complicated, as in need of work, progress, care, than ever before. And I think this is going to be one of the huge things in the next, 10 years.
But when you first tackled it, it must be 10 years ago, maybe more, on Red Nose Day, when that Alistair Campbell.
Oh yeah. That was very.
And it was edgy. I mean,
yeah,
I remember everyone being.
And that's where, being as old as I am, and Red Nose Day having gone on for so long, you really see changes. Disability was one of the first things that we did. Disability, I mean, now it's a huge issue again now, but in a way after the Disability Discrimination Act, there was a real sea change there. Elder abuse, when we started dealing with that, I remember going to see the minister, and the minister said, we said, what can we do? What's the most useful thing we can do? And he said, tell us how much of it there is. He said, we've got no idea whether we're talking 30,000 or 300,000 people. So we did a prevalence study, and it was 300,000 people. It was a lot more. And I think that all the campaign around mental illness is very, is finally getting through to making people see what's in front of their eyes, which is the truth of the sort of 1 in 4 statistic. I mean, my sister took her own life after years of battles. My daughter's partly hit by it because she had an operation that went wrong and spent 4 years in her bedroom screaming. The designer of the movie I'm just working on took his life on Tuesday. So,
yeah,
I think all I'm saying is that those figures used to seem absurd, and the amount of self-harm that there is, and the preponderance of male suicide, and suddenly you think, well, all the people who've been working on this issue, and all the people who've been helping us market it, and all the people who've been saying stuff over the last years, it really is worth, you always hope, in the whole of life, you always hope you're going to get up to the top of the staircase with the next thing that you do, and it turns out you've probably taken one step. But each of those steps is, going to make a difference eventually. And when you get knocked back, as it were, by the wrong president, thank God you've gone up those 4 steps on climate change before you get pushed down a couple.
We've got a little film on mental health. Is there I want to leave a little time for questions at the end, but is there appetite for another film? Roll the film.
Somebody knows me first as Liz, and then I might say I'm a doctor, and then I'll say, oh, and I've had some mental health problems.
Paranoid schizophrenic.
Anorexia.
Borderline personality disorder.
Self-harming.
Schizoaffective disorder.
Clinical depression.
It's not a good line. Hi, I'm Lizzie, I'm manic depressive.
Nutter.
Psycho.
Weirdo.
Mad.
If I break my leg, you can see that it's in a cast. If I'm suffering from depression, you can't see that.
Do you know why it's called cracking up? Because you feel like you're cracking. Your head is cracking into millions of bits.
I've been sectioned round about 10 or 11 times now, although I'm hasten to add I'm not going for any kind of record.
I get a lot of swearing in my head, and, you know, I wake up every morning to stupid effing bitch.
I kind of went to GP with it written on a piece of paper in the third person. Dawn has been shouting Gandalf all weekend, and slid it across the table. It was a eureka moment, because then I knew what was going on. I knew what monster I was dealing with.
People often feel that it's self-indulgent.
These are people who haven't had depression.
It just kills you inside.
1 in 4 people will have a mental health issue, you know, and that's somebody you'll know, somebody you care about.
My parents thought it was probably best to keep me at home because of the stigma of the mental illness and what the neighbours might think.
Once it was in a newspaper, and I was so appalled, I grabbed it out of everybody's hand and said, they're making that up.
A person's mental health symptoms are not the person.
The person likes me for who they think I am, but what would happen if they knew who I really was?
People come up to me, me waving a finger at me, you're a bomb pot.
I would tell people I was gay, right? That was easier.
I've had eggs thrown at my door.
For about 2 years, really, every time I went out of my front door, I get either verbal or physical abuse.
Someone said that my mum was a psychopath.
They gained some sort of credit for beating the psycho up.
One of the questions was, would you be happy living next door to someone with a history of mental health problems? And one woman turned to me and went, I really wouldn't, but only because I've got children. And I said to her, why? Why would that make any difference? I'm pretty sure we don't eat babies.
We need to dispel this myth that we're all crazy mad axe murderers. The only person I've ever harmed is myself.
It's an awful feeling. It's like nobody likes you or loves you.
Nobody really wanted to touch me with a barge pole as soon as they heard I had a mental illness.
Some people think that John's mad and that he's gonna, attack them or to attack their children, so they keep their children away from my children.
Mental illness, I mean, what? I mean, would we live without Churchill?
Abraham Lincoln.
Marie Curie.
Charles Darwin.
Florence Nightingale.
He was just my brother, and he wasn't my brother the schizophrenic. It came as a real shock to me when he took his own life.
You go to the hospital expecting to see somebody else's son.
Suicide is the biggest killer of young men under 40 in this country.
It's the end of your world. It's like someone's taken a piece of you away. You don't ever expect to outlive your children.
The Butterfly Project, funded by Comic Relief, has meant so much to me, because without them I wouldn't even be here.
The local projects supported by Comic Relief are absolutely vital. They provide a social lifeline to people who are very vulnerable and frequently extremely isolated.
Comic Relief really has, through the project that I'm working on, turned my life around.
I'm much more communicative now because of my depression. I'm more appreciative of simple things, so when it's a sunny day or when you're driving along and there's a field full of flowers.
I think it's made me a nicer person, much more tolerant. And I'm not scared of being bipolar. I'm not scared of it anymore.
As far as I know a normal life to be, I live a normal life.
It's actually not a bad thing to be believing
So, don't shun us. We are just like everybody else.
But, the fact that, as it were, the royal family have just joined that film is a real good sign. I'm increasingly thinking, oddly enough, about suicide. I don't know if this is very inaccurate. We've been thinking a lot about it this week, because when my daughter was sick, you'd always think about it as a sort of physical thing. If you had a broken arm, everyone would say sorry and know how you were dealing and watch it healing, but when you don't have that, it's harder. And I've started to think about suicide as a sort of heart attack. Heart attacks don't come absolutely logically, as far as I know. They're not bound to happen on a Thursday. There's just a variety of things and the way that you are and the way you behave that suddenly causes it. And there might have been something that happened or didn't happen that week that means you don't have the heart attack, which means that you would have survived longer. And I'm thinking about suicide as a sort of psychological heart attack, just a series of events that suddenly lead you somewhere which might not have done.
Someone tweeted this morning, we were coming up on the train, and I spoke my attention to it, and there was a tweet when it said, Richard Curtis talking to the PHE conference. Why? I hope that what you've seen over the last 45 or 50 minutes is you know, to my mind, one of the world's greatest marketeers who with usually with no budget manages to find a way of telling stories that are just so extraordinarily engaging, and like your malaria analogy with the bed net, finds a sort of the end of a piece of wool to tug at that can unravel a complicated issue. And I know that for the work that we do with PHE, we very often have very small budgets, and we're always looking for work that aspires to the same quality as Richard. But I just thank you for the work that you've done, and thank you for coming up here today. We've got a few minutes for
taking
questions.
your sister off your hands, whose career was in such trouble after the burst at Radio 1. Yeah.
Is anyone got anything they'd like to ask Richard? Go on. Yes, up there, sir.
Is Hugh Grant as bad as you think he is? Yeah, he is. He's a genuinely wicked person.
You can't ask yourself questions.
No. Okay.
Thanks very much. I wouldn't dare to ask a silly question.
You can ask one of each.
No, I'll do a sensible. But thank you. Inspirational stuff. Really amazing what you've done. And I was particularly impressed that you say you want to be a wolf in sheep's clothing. In England, anyway. So you're not spending money on cancer and donkey sanctuaries and so on, which is the popular things. Are you trying to do the same with the foreign aid stuff? Because, talking to global health folk, it is AIDS in particular that gets all the cash, and also TB and malaria. Whereas a lot of people are saying, well, actually, what we really need is to train up primary care physicians, and we need sewage systems, and we need systems, we need education, and so these sorts of things, system-level things, which are a bit less sexy.
I mean, it's a good question, and it's an endless battle between me and those people who want to raise as much money as possible and want to represent honestly what we do. And it's not a battle, but exactly that's what's being said by the grants department and grants experts, that we should put money into different kinds of things. I say malaria nets, they say holistic health systems. And we'll end up somewhere between the two. So I hope that if you looked at the raft of things, that you would find that both sides are represented. Food, although we do very little of that, and campaigning for land rights, so it is a mixture. It is a mixture.
Yes, Daniel.
Richard, sometimes there's a growing trend to speak of the state as if it wasn't us. The state is failing, the state is over there. But of course the state is the way we organise our own assets and resources. And some of what you've said, I think, is really powerful, but is actually bypassing that state. And I just wondered what your views were about where you also can use that power to get the state to do for us what we want it to do, because it's our state.
Yeah, I mean, that is a very... actually, that's the reason why I'm doing the SDG stuff, because not that the states have been tricked into the Sustainable Development Goals, but they've all signed them, and they're pretty demanding set of things. So it's a strange thing where we're saying to our state, you promised me, and I'm part of you, to do this thing for both of us. So I do think that that's an extremely useful thing. I mean, I'm hoping that this is going to be a very engaged, in a way, I think just as a human being, I've always wanted to do both campaign to change politics and have basic human, compassion to solve things as quickly as you can personally. But I do think that activism is pointed at the state, and asking it to fulfill its responsibilities, is very much on the rise in the younger generation. They really want to know, they don't even want to know where their £5 is going. They don't really want to give the £5. They want to find out who should be giving the £5 and everything. So I hope it will go. But I know what you mean about bypassing the state, and that's been one of the arguments against, as it were, charity over the years. But I think charities have become very sophisticated and very strong in their campaigning in terms of, what politicians should be doing.
Time for one more question. Right here in the middle. You can just shout. And project.
I don't know the answer. We had a 25-year stab at trying to help my sister and couldn't do it. But I think the answer is continue to focus on it so that it does become a priority and we gain expertise and get more resources. The lack of resources available was just the lack of beds, just the place she should have gone. There just was no space. And I was so privileged and we had so much money and so much access and still couldn't do anything. I can't believe what it must be like for someone whose relatives are in that situation and they have nothing. So I'm afraid I would just say that you've got to be very aware of how much we're failing and just bravely take every step, I would say. I mean, obviously don't, think about, I so don't believe in the think about what you could have done, I can't talk about it, but it would I'd get too emotional. But the circumstances of my sister's suicide could not have been jollier, as it were. They were shopping for her birthday party the next day. They couldn't have done everything more right, and that was still the day that she chose to take her life. So I don't think it's in our hands.
I don't want to end there. Can you... Another
nicest person in showbiz.
Nicest person.
Rachel McAdams is very nice. Rowan Atkinson's horribly serious.
Matthew.
Stephen Fry never stops talking.
Matthew, can I make a suggestion?
Yes.
So laughter and tears and very moving, and we've been talking about mental health as the big event, so chime perfectly. You did promise me that you would tell us something about Hugh Grant. And you also mentioned Colin Firth.
Well,
are you going to?
Colin Firth is a bit of a temper, you might like to know, and also his Italian family are very funny with him because they think he's the single most unattractive 50-year-old man they've ever seen. And I remember being with them and him getting into his swimming trunks and literally the father-in-law pointing at him and laughing at how funny he looked. So I feel a bit sorry for Colin. I don't know that any of the stories about Hugh are repeatable.
No, they are. No one's listening. No one's filming.
That's
no one's
problem.
Recording.
He's very...
What about when?
Think of one.
What about when Colin Firth got his Oscar?
Oh yeah, well Hugh Grant was talking about, well, two things there. I don't know if any of you were listening to what Colin Firth said when he won his BAFTA, but he said actually on public TV. I was going for a colonoscopy on the morning when I was meant to be having the audition for the King's Speech, and little did I know that what the doctor was going to do to me was what the director did to me for the next year and a half. And Hugh Grant said that the day that Colin, because Hugh turned down that part, Hugh said the day that Colin won his Oscar was the unhappiest day of his life, including the day of his mother's death.
Yes.
So there we go.
Well, can we say a big thank you, Matthew, and to Richard?
Thank you very much. I mean, I would just like to say it's such an honour to be here and so great for me to be here, because I'm so aware that in terms of comic relief and everything we do, that it's entirely because of people who actually do the real work that anything we do is worth doing. So, you know, huge thanks to all of you for your extraordinary choices in life. And I keep trying to convince my children that being in a pop group is not the way to go. And when I had my first meeting with you, I came home and said, look, you could do this. You could be this useful. So thank you all very much indeed.
So remember dinner this evening, and see you there. Thank you.